Hello, Mariele.
Hi,
I'm
Pontus.
so happy to talk to you. It's been a while.
Yeah,
You are one of the artists I really admire, and I'm so happy that we could include you in this huge exhibition currently in Berlin, traveling to Moscow and Paris, called Diversity United. And uh, you're one of those artists that I really find fascinating due to your versatility and the fact that you seem to be everywhere, literally on the globe, on Earth. You have sort of traversed the perimeters of human and non-human existence on Earth. For instance, I mean, some of your late project, and now I will actually try to share my screen. Let's see how this works out. Hold on.
okay.
You have like recently you've been to the Arctic in recent years. What have you been up to there?
It doesn't even feel that recent anymore, even though I am speaking to Gretel Ehrlich quite a lot recently because of COVID. But I went with her initially, and then she left me alone with the hunters. I went in 2012. So that's almost, well, it's 9 years ago or something, in May even. So it's pretty exactly 9 years ago. And it was the most incredible experience. And one reason why I went was to kind of see it for myself, I think. I've been working a lot, with one or two exceptions, from images, from photographs, from paintings, predominantly from paintings. And I met Gretel Ehrlich and really felt, okay, I would go to Greenland with her because she knows the culture, she knows the hunters, and she was sort of inspiring me to get myself to go, I suppose. And then she only had a week. I was there for over 4 weeks, and it
So
was incredible to sort of
anyhow,
see a lot of the
so
things.
the Arctic is certainly one region that one of the regions that you have explored, but
Yeah.
further down, further on, you've also been, not you personally, but in your artworks, you have also been dealing with the bottom of the sea, thousands of meters beneath the sea level.
Yeah, I've been sort of paired up by Isabel Dust with Alex Rogers, who is a deep sea marine biologist, and he opened up a whole new kind of world, or a sort of loads of images and films to me, and let me use his footage from his expeditions. So it was a really interesting pairing because I suppose my work a lot of the time deals with going to places or not going to places, with the image of places and things like the representation of a place. So I've made a lot of work that was exactly about the sort of weird delay and relay of images from the deep sea that even he sees only on screens on the boat, on the ship, on his deck, and then he can control the camera on the ROVs to go down, back a bit, and all this sort of stuff. This was a different expedition with the GoPro camera you can see on the front there, mounted with 6 lenses. So I made a piece of work very much related to the footage that I then got afterwards. They went to Bermuda, and it was so fully booked I couldn't go. I couldn't join in the end, but it was it's one of those connections with him that is incredible, to talk to him a lot and see a lot of the footage and the images that he lets me use. And possibly next year or the year after, I will actually go into one of these with him. But
Great. So you will
in a
actually go
way, we'll.
down.
Hmm?
You will go down to the bottom of the sea personally.
He's, yeah. Well, we'll wait and see because it's been delayed because of COVID and all sorts of other things. But it's either 2,000 meters down or 4,000 meters down, and it's very impossible to say no to that. Even though it's you would be stuck in a very small space, but at the same time, there's this sort of open. It's a reinforced perspex bubble, if you like, and yeah, I would go if this works out. Of course, I'm gonna go.
Okay. So, and just to continue on this theme of, well, we're still on the bottom of the sea. This is a project about the internet, transatlantic internet cable that you have been working on as well. but let's skip that one. And let's go up in the sky, because that's also a place that you have explored and visited yourself in various ways in your art.
Yes, the images there are photographs of the sky over Greenland. I don't know if you have a close-up with your images, but each pair has a line going through it, which is part of the importance in this project. There's 24 images, so it's 12 frames with paired images from the Arctic sky. And for me, it was really rare and significant that there wasn't, mind you, it's been like that last year. There wasn't any air travel. There won't ever be vapor trails up there because it's so far north. It's sort of beyond the normal air routes. So it was incredible to experience that and not to see ever any vapor trails. But I added in lines, and they did connect initially to the vapor trails, but actually had a lot to do with mapping and kind of putting my stamp on it almost, with mapping and a pendulum. There was all sorts of comments as well. That it was about time spent up there and a pendulum maybe swinging. Each line has got a slightly different angle, and it started with vapor trails and then became this sort of grid or map, or you could interpret it in different ways.
Anyhow, so this is the sky and the seas and the earth are certainly present in your work, and you always been, for a long time, you've been working in collaboration with various scientists and so forth. So I will just continue here. Much of your interest has started with maps and geography, right?
Yes. I always remind myself that maps are at the core of everything I do, really. So it's a significant basis to look at space, to look at time, to look at representation. I was living near the Greenwich Meridian, which is cast there on the bottom left. I was really interested in this sort of idea of a simulacrum and the human need or way that the whole world was charted and represented in maps. And that really fascinated me all the way through. So often I work directly with maps, but also you could talk about cartography probably with most of the tank pieces, with projects that I look at. Mapping out space is key to a lot of the things. Even down there on the bottom right, traveling to the polar circle up in Norway was really important to me, to sort of find places on the map. Or I don't know if you might have an image of the sunrise sunset, but to kind of go to places that are significant in terms of antipodal points or the map itself, really meant a lot to me.
Yeah, we'll come to the sunset and sunrise shortly, but I feel that this work has an incredible actuality right now. It's I mean, we live in a world where maps seem to be changing again. Europe is changing. England is drifting, or Britain is drifting away out into further into the Atlantic, and so forth. And you made this work in '96. That's sort of ages ago. Just tell me about it. It has a funny title.
Never eat shredded wheat is a way to remember north, east, south, west. You've obviously got a different memory thing going on in the German language, but I was always interested in these language and linguistic bridges to sort of remember things and teach people how people get taught at school how to remember north, east, south, west. So I called it that, but then there are subtitles for each one to do with the person who would have done the initial drawing, the memory map, because they're all based on different people's drawings. So I would collect a lot of drawings of the world map. It started initially just with Europe and then expanded to the world map because it was really interesting to see this sort of layer of issues or problems or challenges to draw it, to remember the map as we know it, to put it onto paper, to prioritize or not prioritize where you've been, and all those kind of things played a part in making them very subjective. So I really enjoyed that subjectivity to then translate into my set of maps, which there were quite a few sets of maps. And this was based on sort of school maps. So they were quite large, encapsulated in plastic and all this.
Yeah, so you had people making drawings of the world map from memory, basically.
Yeah.
Were they adults?
Mostly young adults and older adults. I don't think I reached down into sort of kids' age. I think the youngest would have been probably 18 or something. So they're named after them. So you would have Argentinian male 23 or 35 or whatever they were, whoever they were. And it was interesting to see how they would work without looking at a map, of course, just from memory.
I think this project sort of, and the other early ones show how strongly you've been engaging with politics, maps, and geography, ideas of power, and so forth through art, but not only in art.
Yeah, you could say that, but it's the understanding and interpretation of images, or the power of images, and who decides what goes onto an image, or how far spread they are. And obviously it's changed since then because of the internet and phones and everything like that. Photography has a very different status by now, and maps probably do. It almost feels I don't know, it seems nostalgic or something when you now look at maps. At the time when I made these, it wasn't quite like this. Now people work with sat navs and phones and directions on Google Maps and things like this. It's not that often that you see people unfold a map, but unless you go walking, maybe. But do you know what I mean? It's sort of it's an interesting political thing. Also, I was traveling to Japan and places to see a very different perspective and organization of a map, where the center of the map might be. We are used to seeing always the Greenwich Meridian in the middle because it's a European kind of map. So in a way, that was all very interesting to me, to look at subjectivity and how you interpret images, which then translates into other projects later.
What's going on? Tell me about this work, because this is probably one of your most complex works to actually achieve when it comes to logistics.
Well, it seemed like that at the time, for sure, because I set out to, that was the first time I decided, okay, I'm going to go there. I have to go there. I want to go there and try, because I did a trial in England, actually in Cornwall. What it is the sun rising and setting in 2 antipodal points across the globe. So I traveled to the Azores and filmed from a particular point that I worked out on the computer, actually. By then we already had the internet. This is a photo of the other half of the team. I had 2 friends in Melbourne that went down to Wilson Promontory, which happened to be a place where I've actually been. I walked there myself. So that ended up being the other half of the pair. They're filming the sunrise, I'm filming the sunset. And we were filming at the same time. So at that point, it was in 2000, just after the millennium kind of clicked over. It was really interesting for me to see how I could connect us with technology. And we had these massive satellite telephones the size of suitcases. There was no internet reception. We had to connect with satellites, and it was sort of it was quite a different thing. You can see the box there. That's the satellite phone in there. So we were checking with them if they were filming and if I got my calculations correct, that those 2 points were both looking at the sun rising and setting at the same time. And then I recorded it with them for a week, and selected my favorite pair, if you like.
Because it's funny, because the result is probably the most banal imagery you have in it's a postcard motif, the sunset and the sunrise, but it's produced with the most rigorous methods almost imaginable. I mean, the most complex way you can find to actually take a photograph of a sunset and a sunrise.
Well, it's not a photograph; it's a film, Pontus. That's an important
film. I
thing.
know. I know.
It's a
Sorry. Sorry.
moving image because
I
we are
know.
moving.
I showed it in an exhibition once, so I'm happy to have worked with you on that.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that you work so much with this sort of conventional ideas of the conventional imagery. It's sort of a common communal heritage that we have, at least across Europe, with this sunsets and so forth, and not the least since Romanticism and the idea of and that has been explored not the least by artists through painting. And I think that takes us to this, which was maybe one of the first works of yours that I saw. It has this fascinating title, I Don't Know How I Resisted the Urge to Run, and which really confused me and fascinated me at the time. And also the visuality of this work it's more, it has a sort of association to a fairy tale, to this unknown in a forest, threatening and maybe also beautiful and promising, whatever you want. Tell me about these works that started also somewhere in the middle of the 90s.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is, I think, similar to what we just looked at with the sunrise sunset. This is probably also one of the very significant sort of stepping stone pieces where it is really important you have a recognition of the space and the image. You've been there before. It's similar to the postcards, maybe with the sunrise sunset, that there is a sort of familiarity with the space, but then it's very unfamiliar because it's in a particular context and it's framed and cropped and sort of unfamiliar that way, even though that's another whole kind of issue, I think, to talk maybe about the cropping and the framing. But with this, it was really important to me that there was a path and that humans could go through it, and that it was not an untouched bit of nature, if you like, or space. That people who would look at this, the visitors or, the visitors to a gallery, would be very self-conscious of looking at it and seeing and translating maybe themselves into that space, but obviously staying outside. And there's this sort of double nature that I then continued working with quite a lot, that you have this physicality space, physicality in the space. You can see how it's made. You can see the resin and the fabric, the little bits of rope and the water bubbles, the glass. It's kind of, it is what it is. And I deliberately initially put it on these funny little feet so you could see there wasn't any cables or wires or anything feeding into this. What was important was that it was continuously changing is one of the things, and also that it was overlaying this sort of memory of a place or the recognition of a place and the construct of a representation, as well as showing you a very physical sculpture. And that made the sort of weird, what you were just talking about, that it kind of confused you in some way because it was familiar and not.
Yeah, because I think we might be talking to people that haven't seen your work before. So maybe we step back to try to explain, what is this actually? How is this made? What is this object?
Yeah, very around it. It's a three-dimensional tank work where you have sort of a middle of a bit of forest, in this case, can circumnavigate and see from different angles. So whatever was the foreground becomes the background when you go around it. There is always that mid-ground area, and I was certainly looking a lot at paintings. With this one, I was looking at a photograph from near where I grew up, actually, in the Undertal in Germany. The connection of that foreground was really important to me, looking at a lot of paintings where you always had this sort of odd timeline going on in certainly in romantic painting, where you have the foreground being the past, the midground being the present, and the background being the future. So I played a lot with that background being interchangeable with the foreground, and the experience of not knowing what's behind it, but actually knowing exactly what's behind it because you can walk around it. So it was always to do with that double reading, if you like.
So I mean, this also touches on one of those central aspects of your work, and that is how you have explored art history, and not the least German or Romantic art history. Actually, it's not specifically German. It's, I mean, generally the Romantic imagery. I do understand that there are also other periods of art included in your exploration, but anyhow, a lot of focus has been on this sort of the Caspar David Friedrich German imagery, this sort of the sublime landscape of Romanticism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think most people will have seen a reproduction, at least, of the Sea of Ice. This tank was closely based on that painting by Caspar David Friedrich. Thank you. The Sea of Ice, which deliberately was chosen to be familiar in that sense, but obviously totally removed, remote, and Arctic. But because it is such a kind of icon image, I was always curious what happens if you use something that then expands that space in the painting by Caspar David Friedrich into a three-dimensional space where it's almost like the sublime or the notion of a romantic painting becomes a specimen. Because obviously there is this sort of parallel to specimen in these tanks as well. That you pickle, you conserve something, you have a landscape change over time, but at the same time preserved and in there as a sort of something to look at, like a specimen. And that for me was really interesting, to work with something so familiar like the Sea of Ice, for example. I mean, there are some other examples where the image is based on a painting that is very familiar, or based on a painting that isn't. It doesn't really matter. It's, yeah, maybe that, for example, is Heaven the Sky. I made that, it was quite fictional, based on various pieces that I did by then. What was important to me with that was that it was very high. The plinth and the tank were sort of out of reach almost. They were above eye level, so you would look up to the mountain range in a similar way that you might look up to a mountain. So I always liked that physicality of where you place yourself, how you discover something, how you see something, if you're looking down on something, if you're looking up to something, or if it's right in front of you, like a painting. So this was playing a little bit with the notion of it being much closer to a map or real space, rather than a representation or a painted image or something that would be on eye level on the wall, which most of the tanks are. They are sort of placed on that height like a painting would be.
I mean, I've had the privilege to work with you at various occasions, and not the least, I've seen your works in so many different places across the world, because you've been partaking in quite internationally with these, not the least with these tank works. And one of the stunning aspects to me is that they are, well, first of all, the fiction, you can clearly see how it is constructed. There's no illusion about what you see. It's, as you say, it's an object. It is a tank filled with water, and inside you have the pigments in the water that actually, and that's even more fascinating to me, as I've had the privilege to work with you in a few exhibitions, where you actually see the pigments moving in the water over time, which means that these works are not constant. Nothing is fixed in these works. They actually develop over time. And finally, there is a point where you actually have to start all over again.
Yeah, there is a point when it's sort of past the point. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. It's a really important part of those tank works that they change over time. And I always looked at them and do look at them like these really, really slow films. And some projects it's more obvious than in others, where I have deliberately made work where I would set them up, fill them up about a week apart, so you have more sense of that being a film clip or two different moments in the same scene. But as you say, they do change over time. A lot of people might not see that if you go back to the same piece. Of course, you see that, or you might see that. It sort of varies a little bit from piece to piece. But with this one, there's quite a strong change of the fog rising up. Yeah.
And you also play with, as you already mentioned, you like to play and explore aspects of scale. This is one of your bigger landscape works, and certainly maybe the biggest tank work.
It is certainly the biggest tank work with water in it. And it was a great opportunity to have, I can't even remember, it was 3 or 6 months in Spike Island in the studio to develop this. I think I had 6 months, but I made quite a lot of different projects. In fact, I made the forest tank there as well. And it was important in that space that you could go around it. Obviously, you could go upstairs to the balcony. You had various viewpoints and aspects to see it from. But I suppose crucially for me, it was always this sort of image or representation of a mountain range that would normally be somewhere as a background in a painting. It was rare that, well, I think up to then for me it wasn't necessarily the subject of a painting, most likely subject of a lot of photographs. So I kind of, with this one, I didn't base it onto a particular painting, but I looked at a lot of paintings and felt it was important to work with something that's familiar and something that couldn't even be a very different size in terms of experiencing it visually. If you think of looking at a mountain range, you have to be a certain distance away to see that many mountains. So I was really interested in that weird connection to space and to what we can experience and see. Obviously from above it was maybe a bit more like being on a plane, looking out of a plane or something like this. But again, it was important that it was familiar, that you had some kind of point where you could sort of recognize it as something that you've seen before.
I mean, having actually installed this work once with you in an exhibition, it's also it's good to know that I mean, many of your works are really technically challenging. This has a huge weight. There's an incredible amount of water involved in it because of its scale and so forth. It's pretty demanding on on the exhibition spaces and so forth. So it's really not the easiest work to exhibit or install in the first place.
No, not at all. What shall I say to that, Pontus? It's one of those pieces where, yes, you do have to have a team to do this, probably. Yeah. I had a team when I did it the first time even. But the weight is not too bad because it's not very deep. It's only 12 centimeters of water, but spread out over a big space. It's 10 by 20 meters approximately. So, yeah. I think you almost have more trouble with big tanks that sit on one spot with very deep glass, where you have a lot more pressure and weight in some way on a particular spot. Anyway, but yeah, it certainly is a challenge to set this up. Yeah.
Anyhow, let's go on. This is a more recent tank work, which also shows how things have been changing over time. I mean, when you made those early tank works, the references for us who saw them was into art history, to romanticism, to landscape painting, and so forth. But currently, we have a totally different sort of context, a different sort of discourses going on around us. And to me, this sort of is entering the sphere of the slightly dystopian ideas of the climate change, of what's going on around us. But maybe you tell me, what's your idea about this breathing yellow?
Yes, it's. I mean, I agree with what you've just said, and at the same time, yes, of course, it's very similar to the other tanks that I made with a very different head-on, if you like, context. This breathing yellow, what's it called again? Breathing yellow and the world change color. I can't even get it together. It was a Donald Trump quote, actually. That there was a sort of there is a sort of sense, as you say, of pollution, of contamination, of a particular kind of toxicness to the tank, which initially was developed together with working in that space, together with the physicality of that space, which is the mausoleum in the Dutch Picture Gallery, which was initially I was commissioned to make it for there. And then obviously have shown it since then in different contexts. But what was really interesting, I thought, in that space was they had yellow windows, as you can see on this image, which totally soaked the whole space and the air of the space in yellow already. So I doubled up on that and made the tank in there very yellow. So there was a kind of really weird sense of breathing yellow outside of the tank and then inside as well. There was this sort of very different kind of sense of the space around the forest tank and the space inside, and the sort of there is a path in there as well, which you don't see at this point, but you would see the path if you go closer. But there is a sort of different sense of going in and being outside and being surrounded by yellow already in that space anyway, which made it a very different project, a very different sculpture. And if you see it in a white space with normal light or low lights, it's different again, but it's very much to do with this sort of sense of a very toxic other environment. It's less to do with recognizing the forest as such. Well, you could argue that you recognize toxic forest by now, but anyway, it's got a lot to do with how people subjectively interpret that sense of not being quite right. But you almost have that experience when you step into the Dulwich Picture Gallery mausoleum, because it's so bizarre, so yellow. Yeah.
But it's also very immersive work, because if the previous tanks, if not all, so most of them have been objects that you sort of relate to as objects in front of you, this is a work that actually involves, absorbs also the viewer and the space around it. So when you enter, you're actually inside the work, because all the space is part of the work now.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very particularly bizarre space, because I don't expect anybody to necessarily know that, but it was meaningful to me that the mausoleum was bombed in the Second World War, and they sort of rebuilt it, and it was completely fake. There was the pillars were hollow. They were made of MDF. So it was very theatrical. It was so bizarre. It was perfect for what I was doing in some way, because it wasn't even a real space. So the whole construction was part of it in some way. But I think, yeah, that sort of double, it's almost like double or triple of this kind of weird surface or fakeness of a space, and the experience of it being at the same time super real, because it is it's very physical. So I quite enjoy that sort of weird contradiction of it being very sculptural and physical at the same time, totally fake and fictional, if you like. Yeah.
So let's go to Japan now. What are we looking at now?
Well, this is a very large cast of a section of a forest, very much echoing what was going on in the tanks, but doing a large version of it without water, because water would have been insane in this space. This is over 5 meters high, and cast from real trees, and everything you see is made of fiberglass. So this whole piece is, again, it's almost the size of Unrecallable Now. So it's I think this is more like 6 meters wide and 9 meters long and maybe 5 or 6 meters high. That took a long time to construct and remake in there, because it was cast in England, then shipped to Japan, and it's permanently installed in the Tawada Art Gallery. But I was really, what was important to me was that the detail has to be super realistic and almost like sort of photographic, but in 3D. So I cast lots of things in order to achieve that. I was really paranoid that it would be too much like a sort of Walt Disney set or a stage set. This was way beyond a stage set because it had so much detail. It was more like a photograph. And you can see in the front there, you can see the crop, which this piece was a lot clearer, I suppose, maybe clearer than the tank works, because it didn't have that kind of pull that the tanks seem to have, that you kind of can go really close. Of course, you can get close to this, but you're not allowed into it, and you're very much confronted with that crop and edge, and the framing of it in the space is very important. That there is a sort of rectangle of the space represented in there. It's
interesting because to me, it's not only approaching the sort of the art history, the painting and the art museum, but also the Museum of Natural History. This is very close to the dioramas you see in various museums, but of course much more detailed than any existing diorama.
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking at the dioramas in various natural history museums by then and still enjoy looking at them. Obviously in New York in the Natural History Museum it's incredible, but there are also sort of versions of dioramas in a lot of museums, and they certainly would have influenced some of this, I would imagine. But as you say, it's just the detail had to sort of go beyond that, because I wanted that weird sense of recognizing it as a photograph or a hyperreal, photorealistic painting or something, or even a forest. I quite like this sort of slight blending of all those things together at that point. I mean, this was 1-to-1 scale, so it's a very different kind of project.
So it's basically, it is a forest, if not real, so at least.
What do you mean, Pontus?
Scale.
Of course it's not a forest. It's loads of fiberglass, and it stank at the opening. It was still really smelly.
Okay.
And there is the photo also of the other side. I did actually have a view hole into below the forest. You see all the construction, and I wanted to be very visible how it was made and how it was supported.
Yeah, so yet again, you're not working with illusions. You're actually working with real objects.
That was part of the window into the undergrowth of the underworld of the forest, with all the supports, and to see the structure that was holding it up, particularly in Japan.
I like this, well, not so recent anymore, tank work, because it takes it totally out of this sphere of romantic painting and back to where we started, which is the polar regions and the polar expeditions. This is a project that you developed together with a team for the Venice Architecture Biennial, right?
Yeah, Luca Rendina was very instrumental in this, who I've heard he gave a slide presentation about Halley 6, which this is. Halley 6 is a real place, and it's the Antarctic research station that they've built. Luca Rendina is an architect, and they've developed all sorts of architectures, and they still are, to build research stations and make them weatherproof. In this case, it's mobile, and Halley 6 has already been moved once because of a crack in the ice. what was really interesting to me was that he has been since, but he hasn't actually been to Halley 6 yet either. He's been to a different site now in Antarctica, but the office of the architect was full of images that they generated on Photoshop. So it was kind of the fictional actual place, and that's partly was sort of important to me to respond with a tank to the Venice Biennale, the Architecture Biennale, to sort of start with this. I want to introduce some atmosphere into the exhibition, and that's when I started making tanks again, actually. I wanted to make a tank to represent the weather conditions and the actual physicality of the Antarctic space where Halley 6 might be. But it was really interesting to see images, and I'm pretty sure these are real images, but I wasn't always sure when they were just building it and setting it up, what was photoshopped and what wasn't, what was a real thing. But then I think that's an interesting kind of layer to some of these images, that this was the only one and the first one that was based on an actual place, even though it looks entirely fictional. Do you know what I mean?
But I mean, at the same time, it's you've been dealing in various ways with Arctic exploration before that. So this is, in fact, not the first Arctic tank.
No, not the first Arctic tank, but the first tank that has inside a representation of a real place. That is based on, I got the drawings from the architects and got them translated into 3D and got them cut with a CNC machine, and that they were as real as could be, but only models of the architectural plans. But that was a very different way to work than making up the woods or a little cottage or something that might exist or might not exist in a painting. Yeah, no, it's interesting how these things. I mean, obviously, it was sort of similarly made up, but I liked its other kind of life as the real Halley 6 in Antarctica that nobody ever goes to, probably, or some people do, but it is as removed in a funny way. It's much less familiar. When I saw the images first, I thought, "What is this? Is this like a spaceship type thing? What are we looking at?" When Luca was talking about the Halley 6 structure and the reason for them to design it in a certain way, I just thought he was talking about some planetary, I don't know, some fictional architecture rather than real place. So that was quite inspiring.
Well, this takes us to the work you're actually showing in Diversity United, which is what if we all just stopped? This is yet another variation on this theme of this enchanted, maybe early morning forest of Neanderthal.
It's certainly a follow-on from that, yes. It was important to me to kind of have the light pick up on the pigment in the water and create this really particular sense of a place. Obviously, now, 2 years on from having made it, or even 3 years on from having made it, actually, what if you all just stopped? It's one of those titles that resonates very differently today than it did 3 years ago. There are some pieces that I would have made that look very different in different contexts today. Like, I'm sure you might have seen the Raft of the Medusa, where there are these boat people, but I made it years and years and years ago. There was probably it was the first tank I ever made in 2006, in 1996 or something like this. But anyway.
And that's the Raft of Medusa.
Yeah, but today, when you look at it, it's all to do with migration and the fate of a lot of migrants on the ships and drowned boats and all this sort of context and stuff of asylum seekers today that you wouldn't have thought of at the time. It was more of a connection to the painting and the Jericho, and it's just kind of curious that there are, or the drowned village that I made in 2000 and 2001 or 2000. It's got a very different resonance today because of
the Drowned Village. Perhaps we should explain that's sort of a one-to-one work where what you see is the rooftops of a village. It's a church, bell tower of a church. There's a rooftop of a house and so on. All seemingly to be the what do you say? It seems like there has been a deluge.
Yeah.
It's all covered in water except those.
Yeah, they're just sort of sticking out in a lake. Yeah. It's actually in Germany, so I don't know. It's not necessarily that close to Berlin, but it's near Münster. It was part of the Münster Sculpture Biennial, and it's permanently in there. But all I was trying to say was that the context of some pieces, and maybe I shouldn't necessarily point a particular piece, but there are a number of pieces that seem to be very different in today's context. And that's kind of curious how some pieces are made for today's context and some are surviving and changing over time in their interpretation, because they just seem to be very different today.
My dear old friend who passed a few years ago, Gustav Metzger, he said that artists should be intuitive. It's part of the role of an artist to work with that sort of uncertainty, but actually where the works prove somehow true in a different sense over time. Would you agree on that, or is that a too romantic way of putting the role of the artist?
No, I think it's sometimes it's really interesting to see works that mean one thing at one point and then completely change in the perception of the viewer, the artist, and everyone in the context of what's happening. I would agree with that. And it does almost not matter if it started maybe in some traditional context of the Romantic Sublime. I mean, that's kind of what I'm addressing, I suppose, as well, with the contemporary sublime. What does it even mean? There's a technological sublime, and there's so many different sublimes, but I'm really interested in how today the Romantic Sublime gets reinterpreted and subjectively seen anyway, and how that changes. It changes within a few years. And that's interesting.
Interestingly, there has been a huge interest in forests in literature. And I mean, you have, for instance, Richard Powers' wonderful novel, The Overstory. And then you have a number of art exhibitions dealing with forests, and not the least with a whole sort of books about trees and forests, popular science dealing with issues of the ecology and so forth about forests, even the secret life of forests. It seems like what you have been working on has become a center of attention these days.
Maybe. I mean, they keep coming, those exhibitions. There are still a few in production about forests and woods and how we connect to them, if you like. I would sort of say, because my work is so it's not just about the forests, it's obviously also about the Arctic, it's also about the deep sea, it's also about all that work I made in Cern recently, the sort of underground, or the sense of humanity in technology and things like this. There are a lot of different projects. If you look at the sunrise sunset in connection to the forest, yes, there are parallels, but I'm always intrigued to see that I certainly, made work that totally connects to the forest and is about the forest and the experience of that image. But it's sort of that, I hope it's a lot wider than that and bigger than that.
Yes, and it's worthwhile also saying that I mean, your work spans a huge amount of different techniques, spaces and so forth. We work with public space, you work with sound, you work with the video and other sort of media installations. So it's and you've been working with not opera, but yeah, well, actually with music staging and in different ways. So I mean, that's yet again one of those aspects of your versatility as an artist, that it's not really that easy to pin you down, because you actually work across that many media and also questions and issues. So sometimes I believe we might even be simplifying your work publicly with this strong focus on your tanks. But your tanks are, on the other hand, your most famous works. It's sort of the burden an artist has to carry.
Well, I would, yeah. I mean, in some way, that's probably why I stopped making them for a while, because it was never my only occupation. That I've always worked with film or with other ways of working, but there is certainly something going on with the tanks that is very, very difficult to do in any other medium, because there is that sense of a physicality of the play of the sculpture. There is it's very difficult to because I'm not using pixels and I'm not using brush strokes. To a point, there are brush strokes inside there, but it's the liquid, it's the water, it's the chemical reaction that really makes them what they are. So when they're empty, I always call them quite boring, to be honest, because they're just empty. And those sculptures are by far not as interesting as when you sort of stage them and set them up with water and kind of animate them through light or whatever it is, that you can then explore them in a different way. Yeah. But I've tried. I mean, I'm sort of doing all sorts of other things with installations using film, but in a physical different way. Where, like recently, I've made a project where the film moves, the monitors move in the speed that I've shot the film, so it's becoming quite a physical porthole or something. It's like a window into another world, similar to the tanks, but it's a moving image. So yeah, there's lots of experiments going on, but I can see why you say that. But there is something where the sense of the tanks being possibly like to do with an image, to do with recognizing an image and subjectively interpreting it, or how the frame of an image then translates also into other sculptures, into works. I've done quite a lot of works using windows, that you probably are familiar with some of those, where this the sort of recognition of a window as an aperture to see something behind it is not that different to the tanks either.
I mean, it actually reminds me of Duchamp, who made this Étant donné.
Yeah.
His last
the fresh window, which was particularly the window that I've tried to sort of echo a little bit in a project that I did, that I know you're aware of, with the pressure in the where the liquid is trapped in the double glazing kind of thing. Yeah.
But here we have left tanks, but not landscapes. Right, because this work is very much about landscape and power in maybe a variety of ways. Could you just tell me about this project?
Sure, and I think there is a lot of, in my head, certainly a lot of parallel. There are a lot of parallels going on between the tanks, in a way, and these pieces, which are made in a residency I did in Headlands in San Francisco, or rather outside of San Francisco, in Marin County on the other side of the bridge. And they have a military former defense station there, which is now only functioning as a museum. So they have 9, I think by now it's only 9 missiles, but they used to be fully loaded nuclear missiles, and they're all in the basement of that defense station, former defense station. So they've brought all the kit sort of nearby to make it more into a museum. But one of the things I did also, you can see at the back, there is a rubbing of the radar, the big dish that was communicating across to the outside world and to the missiles themselves. So these missile rubbings on the floor are life-size rubbings of the missiles, as much as the radar is a life-size imprint, like a sort of death mask of the objects. And it sort of started with being just very frustrated seeing photographs in my camera and on the laptop of those things, and knowing and having worked a lot with scale and size with the maps and so on, there was definitely a point when I just got very frustrated by the images and wanted to take something away that was real size, real scale, and impossible to represent in any other way. So these are over 30 meters long. So in a way, yes, they are about technology and power, and there is a long story to do with having met some of the veterans and talked to them. And
yes, because these are nuclear missiles.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and they're decommissioned by now, but they were functioning fully fledged nuclear missiles at the time, and they kept them and decommissioned them and made them safe to visit. And when they have their open days once a month, they actually have the veterans in the museum to talk to the public, which was incredible. But I worked there sort of throughout the month anyway, and had access to filming them and rubbing them and doing all sorts of things that I wanted to do. So that, yeah, they were nuclear missiles, and they had the sort of missile heads and everything in other display cases. There was a lot of more detail about this, but it was a great space in Trondheim to show them on the floor there like that. I really enjoyed putting them there. I was made for it, that space.
Yes, I mean, I'm very happy because I was actually the curator of the thing.
Yeah.
Yes, they looked glorious. This is where you are, if not currently, but one of your ongoing projects. This is a Cern laboratory in Switzerland. Tell me what's going on.
Well, this one, there is a lot of ongoing projects. I shall add, and this one is one that is sort of the most recent works are all to do with Cern and some of the materials that I got there, which are either photographs or a lot of tracking films, meaning I would go down there with tracking device and pipings and a film person, and we have tracked quite a lot of the spaces in Cern, both above ground and underground. This is one thing that I didn't realize until I actually went to Cern, that there's about 100 experiments above ground, as well as the big Hadron Collider that everybody seems to know about, and of course is not accessible when the nuclear powers are working in there, then it's closed off to the public entirely, or to humans, if that. What you're looking at here is part of the Hadron Collider, where they are just doing some maintenance work and recalibrating certain things, and the pipe in the middle that's going across is where the particles would be shot through for 27 kilometers. Big circle. Anyway, I'm very aware of the time. I could go into the whole logistic of Cern now, but I've been really fascinated in Cern to look at the materiality and the surface of it all, being somebody that hasn't studied quantum physics, but being very interested in how that high level of technology works on experimental kind of levels in the various experiments and in the Hadron Collider itself. So I've been looking a lot at cabling, at the tinfoil and the protection of the nuclear. Yeah, I should probably explain that when the particles get shot around the collider, there is a lot of nuclear energy that gets then channeled into the experiments. So all the experiments above ground, most of them get fed some kind of output from the collider when it's running. So it's interesting to even learn that you can only access certain experiments when it's off, or on in a certain way. And I did a lot of work to do with that surface of this incredible technology in the different places. And most recently, it was to do with the Alice detector. It's one of the 4 detectors where they record or photograph the protons and the particles going around the circuit. And I spent quite a lot of time both in the cloud experiment and in the Alice detector, which was sort of, I'm not sure what detail me to go into, but it was just incredible to work with them, and still is.
So this is something that will materialize in various ways. What sort of medium am I going to work with in this case?
Well, I've worked with photography and film mainly. The film work that I've finished, which is sort of now part of the Cern collection, but it's a very physical installation of 2 monitors being fed information in a random program of films taken in the cloud experiment, which is above ground, which I should say is very particular in that it seems to be the only experiment that really has influence on policies and climate research and things like that, because they can, in the cloud experiment, they can reconfigure and reprogram the main cloud tank, whatever the experimental container, if you like, with different atmospheres around the globe, so that they could program it to be 100 meters above Helsinki, with the chemicals all completely matching the real measurements, and then experiment with what would happen if you did this, or a mile over Tokyo, or whatever. You can kind of reprogram the sort of the particles inside. And that was really fascinating in a way, because of course there is a relevance to all the experiments to something, but that seemed to be the most immediate experiment having influence on politics and policies and so on. So that seemed to matter a lot. But what I've done with the Alice one, which is sort of, it's a lot, it seems to be a lot to do with this sort of going underground and again tracking shots of the experiment itself and the detector. But I've overlaid it with somebody talking about the human eye, which again actually is something that connects to a lot of the other pieces, this sort of perception through the mechanics of the human eye and how we physically can see things and how it turns everything upside down and so on. So I filmed in the Alice experiment, and while a lot of the footage is all to do with going down and looking at the detector, it talks about the human eye. So the voiceover or the text over in the case with the VNA is all about somebody talking about the human eye, but it's so close. It's as if he's talking about the photography in the experiment. So yeah, it's hard to describe if you don't see it, but it's sort of that's what I'm enjoying. I think this sort of weird clashing of 2 realities, of a biological circumstance and a technological circumstance, and putting them together.
I'm really happy that we're closing on this image, because we sort of started, well, at least your career as an artist started with exploring this sort of the romantic sublime, the landscape and so forth, and issues related to how power is expressed in art in the Romantic era. But now we have certainly left the Romantic tradition far behind us, and this is instead sort of a top-notch European collaboration. This is actually one of the most meaningful outcomes of international and European collaborations that we have currently, a totally functional scientific collaboration, and in some sense almost a utopian idea of collaboration in a time when so much is about dystopic ideas about the future. How do you look at the future of Europe currently? I mean, having been involved with European art and European science over such a long time?
God, that's a big question. I'm not sure if I've got the answer, but obviously there is all sorts of things going on at the moment, and inseparable from what's going on with COVID, which is a global issue, so it's not just European. And as you were saying, that the Cern project is so international, again, it's kind of way beyond European, and that's partly what attracted me to working with this sort of Antarctic or Arctic, probably more Antarctic, because that's sort of more international even. But if you're looking at Europe and the future of Europe, it could become quite a bleak picture, but I'm trying to sort of stay positive and interested, even though I'm, as a German living in Britain, it's a pretty weird situation at the moment with Brexit and all these things. So I'm sort of clinging to my European passport, but I'm living on this, as you described, Britain to be this island that seems to be floating off into the distance. But at the same time, there's a lot of good things going on over here. So it's kind of curious. Also curious how some of the scientific collaborations with European funding and so on, and the Horizon, I don't know, is it called 2021 now? That whole project is apparently still going with Britain. So I'm kind of intrigued to see what happens as an outfall from Brexit. But at the same time, I think we're all aware that there's a lot of very peculiar politics emerging in different places in Europe and beyond. So I just think in some way to carry on making work that really tests and forces you to reassess your perception or understanding of situations is really important, more important than it ever could be. It sort of encourages me to carry on with what I've started in different ways, I guess, to possibly have an influence on how you see and how you understand things, and how you how aware you are of your readings and interpretations of things and stuff like this. I don't know if I possibly can answer your question, because it is a big one.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mariele. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I think we filled time enough for the editor to deal with, but I'm happy to talk to you again, and just carry on with your good work. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you, Pontus.